concerned. I hope everybody's having a good time. My name is Jay Jacobs. I'll be your moderator today for this panel discussion. You are all here to discuss this book. If you haven't heard about it before, it is a fabulous book. It's a book that Leonard Nimoy has called, one word, astounding, you would expect. You're going to hear the story about this book and about the making of the original series as seen by its author, and you'll learn the whole story about it today. We are very, very pleased to have with us on this panel the author of the book, Marc Cushman. Marc has spent the better part of his writing career as a screenwriter. His credits include Star Trek: The Next Generation, which is where this all began, Beyond Belief, Fact or Fiction, Diagnosis Murder, Bachelor Pad. He also has written another television-related history book called I Spy, History of the Groundbreaking Television Series. This is his second television history book, and it is an absolute masterpiece. Sitting next to Mr. Cushman are two people you may very well be familiar with. On the far right is John D.F. Black. He was an associate producer and script consultant for the original series during the first season. And sitting to his left is his lovely wife, Mary Stillwell, during the time that the series was being produced, who was an executive assistant on the staff, and now Mrs. John D.F. Black, Mary Black.
Yay!
He left Star Trek with something.
And he left something good. He left with something good. She's a lovely lady. They're both nice people. Very pleasant to work with. Let's get right down to business. I have to ask Marc the first question. Why did you decide to do a book on Star Trek?
I'm crazy. To have done a book like this on Star Trek. This is actually the first of three, one for each season. So it's 600 pages next to it, the same length. I met Gene Roddenberry in 1982. I was working for a company here that wanted to do a TV special on Star Trek. They sent me down to interview him, and he showed me, among other things, his collection of 70 boxes about this big, filled with all the memos, all the scripts, all the drafts of the scripts, the drafts of the outlines from the series, and the censor reports, just about everything you can imagine. And I had loved a book when I was growing up called The Making of Star Trek, but it wasn't complete enough for me. I wanted to keep reading it. And it was written while the show was still in production, so it really didn't tell the whole story. So I saw those boxes and I said, why don't you do something with this? And he said, why don't you do something with this? And he dared me to put it in a book, and I was busy on TV. I couldn't at that time. So I finally did, but I really didn't because it took 3 books. That's just how much stuff there was.
Why 3 books? Why?
Well, there was so much stuff, Jake.
That's it?
It could have been more than this. And it's funny that I'm getting letters every day from people who read this book. And they say they wish it was bigger. When I was writing it, everybody thought I was crazy. They said, aren't you done with this? I've been working on it for 6 years. Are you ever going to finish that book? And 600 pages on each season. But what I do is I do about 15, 20 pages on each episode. So you see all the memos going back and forth between the staff, between John and Gene and Bob Justman, the network, all talking to each other as they're developing the scripts. What they like, what they don't like, the ones they couldn't make because they couldn't budget them. Usually that was Bob Justman. So get rid of this. And of course the network telling you to do things you couldn't do, and you're doing things that the network didn't want you to do. So it's fascinating stuff for me as a writer to read all of that. And then, of course, the production dates, what happened on all these dates, who got sick, who was in a car crash on the way to work. Michelle Nichols had to get stitches inside her lips so they could photograph her, things like that. You know all this stuff. What they were shooting the day Bobby Kennedy died, and the fact that they were crying, and then the director says action, and they had to get it together, do the scene, things of that nature. And so it's all the information taking you through the entire episode, every episode.
Yeah. You have not made a career of writing books.
No.
You've basically been a screenwriter for all of your career. What kind of influence did that have on the writing of these books?
Well, the difference between a book writer and a screenwriter is in screenplays, it's happening now. It's happening in front of you. television and movies is happening now. If you're watching Robin Hood, it's happening right now, immediately in front of you. Where in most books, they're talking about history or something that happened a long time ago. So as a screenwriter, you're sitting there watching the episodes be made. A lot of the pictures we chose are clapboards. So you're setting up the shots, getting ready to slate the shot with Shatner and everybody standing behind them, or rehearsing with the director, things of that nature. So you feel like you're sitting in the office watching the scripts being prepared by doing these memos. And you find out that you have the bathroom. You were the one with the bathroom. Justman had the bathroom. That's right. Justman had the bathroom. And then, of course, during the shooting, you know what's going on. So it's literally happening. It's unfolding right in front of you.
Did you use any kind of special techniques to transport us back to that time?
It's a time machine, yeah. I mean, what I just mentioned, of course, but I also tie it into what was happening on that day. I'll tell you what song was #1, what movie was #1, what everybody was watching the night before on TV, what news story broke that day. Because a lot of that ties in. And as the scripts were being written, what was breaking in the news that week influenced how they wrote the scripts, or even what stories they put into development. So you find out the background of all that information. Why did they make Spock's brain? You're going to find out. And they had good reason. It just didn't work.
One of the things I like best about this book and this set of books is that they dispel all kinds of folklore. Tell us about that.
The folklore out there is incredible. About half of what you read on the internet, and sadly in the other books, is not true. The truth is in the files, and that's why Gene Roddenberry and Bob Justman and John Black and Dorothy Fontana and so many others wanted me to write these books because they documented everything. And most TV shows don't. Most TV shows take meetings, but you guys wrote memos. And it was because Gene and Bob in particular knew that this was something important. And they wanted it documented, everything that they went through to make this show. It was an impossible show to make back then. They had to invent everything, all the special effects, so they documented it.
So, what are there are lots of misconceptions and lots of myths. What are some of the most common mythologies?
Well, the biggest one is the ratings. Was Star Trek successful on NBC? No? No? We were always told it wasn't, right?
It was.
It was, check out the ratings in here.
It sold color television.
The Man Trap had a 47% share. 47% of the TVs in America were tuned in. Star Trek quite often won its time slot against ABC's #1 rated show, Bewitched, and one of CBS's top rated shows, My Three Sons, on Thursday nights. It was NBC's top rated Thursday night show, and yet they tried to cancel it. They moved it to Fridays. It lost a lot of viewers because who's home Friday nights? Well, me, John, but a lot of people weren't. And yet it was still NBC's top rated Friday night show, and they tried to cancel it again. So they moved it to 10 p.m. And it was still not their top rated, but it was their second rated show that night. It was beating the competition on ABC every week. So it wasn't about the ratings, it was about the relationship they had with Gene Roddenberry. So we were fed a lie, and nobody's bothered to check into it.
Why?
Well, oh my God. I licensed the ratings from Nielsen. And I called Nielsen to do this, and they said they didn't have them. They said, we don't keep the ratings going back that far. Why would we? We're into the business of collecting new data. Who cares about ratings from the 1960s? And I called NBC, I called Academy of Arts and Sciences, I called Museum of Broadcasting. Nobody had them. And then I called Nielsen back. They still told me no. And then one morning I woke up, and I don't know why. I think Gene visited me in my sleep. But I called Nielsen back, and I said, I would like to license the ratings from the 1960s. They said, oh, certainly, we'll transfer you. They had them all. Nobody's ever bothered to do it because nobody's taken the time and wanted to spend the money. It wasn't cheap.
But why didn't we know about them then?
Well, we did in a way. There are articles that I found in the archives from Daily Variety and Broadcast Magazine that would say Star Trek won the slot last time. But they were sporadic. The reason they were sporadic is back in the 1960s and 70s and 50s, the ratings were not shared with the public or even the trade papers. Only on occasion, maybe during sweeps, only the shows the networks wanted you to know about. They didn't print the whole list. And the reason why, the ratings from Nielsen at the bottom, it was stamped, property of A.C. Nielsen must be returned to A.C. Nielsen. Do not photocopy. So you can only share it with your sponsors. And there was a good reason for this. They didn't want John to ask for a raise. They didn't want Wade Shatter to ask for a raise. The only way to keep people working at a good price in their minds was to not tell them if they had a hit. So it's only lately, in the last 20 years, that people are told how successful shows are. So now you're making $1 million an episode if you're an actor on a show. William Shatner was making $5,000, and he was one of the top paid actors in the business. $5,000 an episode. That would be like maybe $70,000 today. Hardly $1 million.
He's made some money since then. I don't feel real bad.
And you probably use price, don't you?
Yeah, I do, as a matter of fact. One of the things that impressed me about this series of books is there was an order to shows that we all thought they came out in, or were produced in. But that's not correct, is it?
No. If you think you know the order the shows were produced, you don't. You're basing that on the production numbers. And the DVD release is based on the production numbers. For the most part, they're right, but there are exceptions. Because what would happen is, for instance, they were going to shoot A Taste of Armageddon and then Spacey. Well, A Taste of Armageddon wasn't ready to go. They hadn't built all the sets yet. So they pulled Spacey forward because it was a bottle show. Yet the production number, and if you're watching it on DVD, it'll tell you Spacey came after A Taste of Armageddon when it really came before. Same thing in second season, third season. So there are a few exceptions. So if you really want to watch these things in the order that they were produced, now you can.
But some people might not be familiar with the term bottle show.
The bottle show means it took place on the ship. They didn't have to build new sets. They had 2 stages for Star Trek. Stage 9 was for all the interiors of the spaceship. Stage 10 was for the planets. And they had a big cyclorama, and they lit the skies with different colored lights. That was Matt Jeffries' inspiration. Instead of repainting it every week, we would put different colored lights on the gels on his lights, and you could turn it to red, or whatever he felt the script implied. If it was an angry planet, he gave it a red sky, a happy planet, a green sky, whatever. So that was stage 10, but it cost money to move over there, it cost money to build sets and everything, so a bottle show was the cheapest show to make. And surprisingly, bottle shows like John's episode that he wrote, The Naked Time, and Dorothy's Charlie X and Balance of Terror, some of the best shows were bottle shows. But NBC was always fighting them to do more planet stories because the opening dialogue said, strange new worlds, strange new planets. And so NBC said, well, we want to see one every week. Star Trek couldn't afford to give you a new planet every week. They did it every other week.
You know, in Herb Saller's book, he indicates that Paramount ditched the series because it cost too much money and there weren't enough episodes to syndicate. First of all, is that true? And also, what was an average budget for this show?
The first season budget was $195,000. That would be equivalent to about $1.3 million today. Star Trek was the second most expensive series on TV. The most expensive series was I Spy at that time, because that was shooting all around the world, so they had to travel. So it was bankrupting Desilu, and that's why Paramount ended up buying Desilu, because Lucille Ball went broke. Her board of directors begged her not to do Star Trek. She was determined to do Star Trek. Would you ever know that? I Love Lucy, Lucille Ball was the person who gave us Star Trek and lost her studio because of it. Yeah. So they rarely, in the first season, with $195,000 per episode, only 4 episodes came in on budget. The rest of them, 25 episodes, went over budget. The pilots went over budget massively. They always took, they were supposed to shoot them in 6 days, most of them took 7, 8 days, except for the bottle shows. And so the studio wanted to get rid of the show because they said, we're going to go broke, and they did. The network didn't want to pick up the extra money.
Yeah, I think it's a good time to ask John a question or two. First of all, John, your job was as a story consultant.
Yes.
And during the time that you were story consultant, during those first 16 episodes, my understanding is that about 50% of all scripts were rewritten by either you or Gene Roddenberry. And that Gene Roddenberry's rewriting aside, Why did you have to do so much writing on these scripts?
Because Gene Roddenberry wanted it done. The bizarre thing about Gene was that he had a compulsion to change people's work. He had to get in there and put his own mark on it. He had to get in there and play with it. And I didn't. But I had to do what I was told. He was my boss. And when the boss says, you write, change this scene and change it to this, I had to do it.
So, but even after you were done doing what he did, what you did, he would rewrite again.
Yes, absolutely. He couldn't leave anything alone. When I delivered my first Star Trek script, for example, The Naked Time, I delivered it on a Friday. Monday morning, I hear, when I came in, I better get into my office and sit down. Well, it was my first draft, and the Writers Guild said that I had the right to do a first draft, a second draft, a rewrite, and a polish. So I went into my office and sat down, and Mary came in and said, Gene rewrote you over the weekend. And I went in and I said, what the hell do you think you're doing, Gene? I mean, if I don't know the show and I'm the story executive, and I'm an associate producer and I've watched every minute of this show being shot, why did you rewrite me? He said it had to be done. And that was that. So Herb Solo, who was the head of the studio at that time and head of the television branch, said, it's Gene's show, do it. Bob Justman said, it's Gene's show, do it. So I was stuck.
Yeah.
That's when the disaster started for me with Star Trek and why I didn't last longer than 16 shows.
Well, I suspect that you had to make a lot of compromises in this process.
Yes, I did.
What were some of the compromises that you guys had to make on these scripts?
I wish I could remember. In fact, I'm glad I don't remember. Because the compromises, Gene was not I think Gene had one great idea in his life, and that was Star Trek. After that, I don't think, he wasn't a writer really. He wrote, but he wasn't really a writer the way that George Johnson was, or Harlan Ellison was, or Teddy Sturgeon was, or the way I was. He wasn't a writer like us. He wasn't a journeyman. He didn't work in many genres. But still in all, we had to live with it, and we did. And didn't like it much. And as soon as I could get out of there, I did.
There were lots of failed ideas in this process, weren't there, Mark?
Lots. Yeah, a lot. A lot of scripts that were written that didn't get produced by very famous science fiction writers, a lot of treatments that got written that didn't make it to screenplay. Because the stories were either too hot to touch, a couple of them written by Gene, or they were too expensive to make, so they had to abandon them. So they had more scripts developed than any other show. They spent more on scripts than any other show, because most shows will shoot everything they write. Star Trek couldn't, because they'd write it and say, how do we make this? There's no way to make this. As the show went along, they got a little better at figuring out what they could do and what they couldn't do. But even in the third year, a lot of scripts were written that they couldn't produce.
You both mentioned a lot of really prominent science fiction writers from the time. These guys were not screenwriters.
No. Well, Richard Matheson was, he had written for Twilight Zone, and George Clinton Johnson was. Harlan Ellison had written for The Outer Limits. A few of them had, but quite a few of them had never done television before. Theodore Sturgeon had never done television. And so his script was rewritten quite a bit by Gene, and quite a bit by Gene Kuhn as well. And Norman Spinrad and a few others, Robert Bloch, they were all renowned science fiction writers, but a lot of the ones that didn't get produced were Isaac Asimov, people like that, Ray Bradbury. They couldn't get the scripts made because they were just too difficult. By the way, John wrote scripts that he didn't take credit on. John did most of the writing on Bud's Women. John did most of the writing on a couple other scripts. Miri was another one. And the reason John would write, unlike Gene And I went through all the drafts of all the scripts, and it's all in the book. You can see the differences, who did what. John, the show hadn't premiered yet. So all anybody could watch, these writers, is they could watch the pilots. And the pilots didn't even have all the characters. McCoy wasn't in either of the pilot films. So how do you make McCoy sound? So John would work with the writers, help them develop their stories. That's what a story consultant does. And then he would do the first polish on the script after the writer was done to make the characters sound like they were supposed to. Because the only two who knew was you and Gene. And then your contention is then Gene would take the script and do additional rewriting that didn't need to happen.
Yes, indeed.
But John, you wrote some other very important material for the show that was not body copy in the scripts.
Well, no. I worked with Gene when we did the opening piece, the piece that Billy Chapman did, would do at the beginning of every show. You know, "Woe he go where no man has gone before," that speech. Well, Gene was supposed to have it done the day before we were to shoot it. He didn't have it done then. He said he'll have it in the morning. In the morning, he still didn't have it. He hadn't done that 2-minute or 1 minute piece. So we sat down and did line for line. I'd do a line, he'd argue with it, and then we'd do another line. And then I'd argue with it, and he'd do another line. And we did that until we finally got what you have heard over and over and over again. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. And it's telling, it's crushing. The line is so clean and so right that I'm very glad I had a part of it. I do want to give you some information, though. The 5-year mission, well, what 5-year mission was, why it was 5 years, was that's because that's how many show segments we needed to go into syndication after the show quit running. And so we had to do 5 years of shows, whatever number they were, to sell it to the smaller stations and get the big bucks. But nobody ever asked, why is it 5 years? And so I'm telling you, whether you want to know what I do.
Business. And by the way, I have all the drafts of that back and forth between John and Gene. John is the one who wrote Space, The Final Frontier. And John is the one who wrote Where No Man Has Gone Before. Gene wrote the stuff in between.
Thank you very much.
Did Gene ever have an idea that the staff talked him out of?
Well, Justman did a lot of talking about shows that we couldn't do, and Gene would have to acquiesce because it was just impossible to do them. Too much money. For example, Harlan Ellison had, in one of the beats in his piece that he did, the first one, this merry-go-round with kids riding on it, and it was whirling and whirling and whirling, and suddenly it took off, and it went through timber doors and on the side of a mountain and disappeared inside, and the doors closed. And he thought that was wonderful. He fought tooth and nail. He said, that's easy to do. You can do that by this, you can make a miniature, you can do, and Justman told him he was nuts. He couldn't do it that way, not with children on the merry-go-round, no matter what you did. G.R. said, you're right, to Bobby. And Bobby told Harlan, you've lost your tamper doors and your merry-go-round. Harlan didn't like it, but what the hell.
Mary, there's some interesting stuff in this book about Harlan Ellison and City on the Edge of Forever.
Yeah.
You have some intimate knowledge of this particular episode.
Harlan's.
I don't know how many of you are familiar with the character of Harlan Ellison. He's extraordinary.
Yeah.
I hope you won't mind my saying this, but his nature is such that he would be very much at home in this atmosphere. because he also went his own way all the time and played his own games and did what he felt like doing and said whatever he felt like saying. And one of the things he felt like doing was going to the set and not taking the trouble to write to justify his existence there in Star Trek. So finally, John and Bob and some others, knew the only way to do it, to get Harlan to finish, or at least come close to finishing, was to lock him into the small office that he had acquired in the building where all of us were. And after a while, John needed to check on him and realized that there was no sound typewriter inside that office. Harlan had crawled out the window and he was over at the set, hanging out with the actors. That's why Harlan was in the business. To write, yeah, but also hang out with actors and actresses.
Well, he wasn't the only one that was problematic, though. What about Paul Schneider?
Oh yeah, Paul Schneider. Well, Paul Schneider was more recognizable with writers' quirks because Paul was chronically late with material. And this one day, well, filling you in on the form, I had my outer office, John had his inner office. I would take a call that was directed to John and be able to fill him in before he had to pick up and confront whatever he had to confront. So a call came in from Paul Schneider, who was due in about 20 minutes for a story meeting. And I went in to prepare John for the call. And I'm afraid I was laughing because I said, John, you were frequently late with material, and I had to fib for you and say that you were in the shower, and you had a 3-day shower once. But this time, Paul Schneider is going to tell you that he is late delivering the material because he was on his way in, but he was at the top of the hill where he lives, and he got a flat tire, and he was changing the tire, and then the tire rolled down the hill. He's going to be even later. And John took the call prepared, and that was the story that Paul Schneider told you, and you managed to keep a straight voice, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, really, Paul? That's a shame. I'm sorry. When will you be able to come in? No, we can't wait 2 weeks. All right, Friday.
What was an average day like for you two?
Oh, God. I was obligated by contract and by Roddenberry's memo to go to the set twice a day. One in the morning and one in the afternoon to check out what's going on. Was everybody doing what they were supposed to do? Was the director not making changes that he shouldn't make? And so on. Well, that was part of it. Then there was the fact that I had 2 scripts that I owed people off the set, not Star Treks. I owed A Run for Your Life, and what was the other one?
Laredo.
Laredo. I owed those 2 people scripts. It was okay in my contract. They okayed that. Mr. Solo agreed that I could do that, as I could. So I had to write one of the other of those every day. I had to do changes that Roddenberry asked me to make. I had to meet with the writers, each one, at least 5 times on any draft, because they would get confused. Roddenberry would call somebody and say, listen, I want you to change this. I want it to be such and such and such. And they would say, okay. And then they would try and make that change. But the change didn't work with their script. And it got rather confusing sometimes. But that was the way that every day went. We got to go to lunch sometimes.
And dinner, because we were working until 2 a.m. a lot of days. So we did take time out for dinner as well.
Yes. But don't tell Gene Roddenberry.
Let me ask all 3 of you. What are some of your favorite or least favorite episodes from the series?
Well, I happen to like my own. I don't know why I would like Naked Time best of all. I did like Harlan's script for City on the Edge of Forever. That was a beautiful piece of work. That was his show. That was his finest piece. And when Roddenberry changed it, I thought it would kill it. It should have, because he was so deeply involved with that script. So I would have to say that the two scripts that I liked the best were City on the Edge of Forever and Naked Time.
I would probably say the same, but I realize that I just want to make one script reference. Because we were there and we were interacting with the people there, I got kind of close to Dorothy Fontana, and Dorothy was working on Charlie X the whole time. She was also working as a secretary. And it came time for Dorothy to turn it in, and I'd always do the first reading for John. And when the script arrived from Dorothy Fontana, I had a kind of, oh my God, what if it's awful? She's such a nice person, and what if it's awful? And I was so relieved when I read it and found out that she could really write. It was a great sense of, I don't have to think bad about somebody that I want to think good about.
What about you, Mark?
I think a Dorothy Fontana script too, probably The Side of Paradise for me. For the first season, because this book is on the first season. City on the Edge of Forever, of course, Naked Time. Naked Time may be my favorite. I'm not saying that just because you're here, John, but because it was such an entertaining episode. It was such a this was the sixth episode filmed, and he had all the lead characters showing their insides out. How daring is that? Just a few weeks earlier, the fourth episode film, they had Captain Kirk trying to rape his yeoman. How daring is that? And NBC was not happy about that at all. But I think Naked Time, The Side of Paradise were all great because they really would challenge the characters. Balance of Terror was a great episode. Corbin, I remember. Oh, there were so many.
What about these two?
Well, in writing these books, the most interesting thing for me, the most enjoyable thing, is the ones that don't work. What's the worst episode from season 1?
Alternative factor.
Alternative factor.
Yeah.
You want to know what went wrong with the alternative factor?
Everything?
It's in the book. Well, you're right, because it's a domino effect. And that's one of the things I like to do with these books, is to find out what went wrong. You know, what went right and what went wrong. And with that episode, that was going to be the first interracial kiss. Because they had John Drew Barrymore cast to play Lazarus, big name at that time. And they had Janet McLaughlin, who was big on the stage but hadn't done a lot of TV, a black actress. And NBC approved the scripts, and it was a good script. But the day before it started filming, they found out that Janet was black and they knew John was white. And they thought, uh-oh. And NBC was a very liberal-minded network. They had I Spy on, so of course they were. But any network has to worry about all their affiliates, and will the affiliates in the South show this? So with that concern, they had to say, take that out of the script. Well, John Drew Barrymore was in makeup, and he's reading these pages that were rewritten that morning, and the script's been gutted. And he says, this isn't what I agreed to do. And he walks. And they're scrambling to try to find somebody to replace him. And Shatner says, oh, I did a pilot once with Robert Brown. He's a great actor. Let's give him a call. And Robert Brown lived way outside the city. And he drove in. And he gets in there to have a meeting. He's never seen Star Trek. It only premiered a week before. And he comes in, and Gene Roddenberry meets him and says, okay, let me take you to makeup. What are you talking about? And Gene says, you got the part. Shatner says, you're good. You got the part. He said, what part? What's this show? And he has the script, and he says, okay, read this. And John and Robert Brown had never done a science fiction before. So he's trying to make sense of all this stuff. They're behind schedule now. They're trying to do catch-up. The script's being rewritten as they're shooting. The director's having a breakdown, and everything's going on. So that's what happened to the alternative factor. That's part of the story. You'll read the rest. So you get to find out what went wrong, because it's the same talented people. Why did that one fall apart? There's usually reasons, and the reason was usually NBC.
We're really kind of running out of time. I suspect there are some questions out there that people would like to get up to the mic and ask. But I want to make one thing, or say one thing that I neglected to say earlier. John, in my introduction, I should have been more explicit about the kind of writing that he's done. Let's just say he wrote for every television show that was being produced during that period of time. But most remarkably, you may or may not know that John wrote the first black exploitation film, Shaft.
And you know what's called black exploitation? John Black wrote it.
Do we have any folks out there who would like to ask some questions? Mark, or not taking the weapon with him? That's good.
One of the things I read about City on the Edge Forever was one of the things they ended up, that ended up causing a major tiff between Roddenberry and Ellison in later years is Roddenberry made an off-the-cuff remark about that the script featured Scotty dealing drugs, and Harlan then had to go and set the record straight and said, no, it isn't Scotty who's dealing drugs. There is a drug-dealing crewman, but he's just one of the enlisted men who's in the dirty junk business. And ultimately, they ended up snip. It wasn't just Gene, it was also the network, because they said, guys, you can't show a drug-dealing crewman on the show.
Right.
And it ultimately, Ellison pretty much walked out and said he'd never work in that show again.
And he never did.
Yeah.
There's only about a half dozen lines of dialogue in The City on the Edge of Forever that were written by Harlan Ellison. Most of the dialogue was written by Gene Kuhn, Dorothy Fontana, Gene Roddenberry, and even a little bit by Stephen Karabatsis. John had left the show by that point, but John helped develop the story with Harlan, where all the dialogue was written by these other people. So it's still a brilliant story that Harlan came up with, and his script won the Writers Guild Award. But, but Gene's version with Dorothy and Gene Kuhn and all them, they won the Hugo.
Oh,
so they both versions are excellent.
Yeah. There's a bunch of, you mentioned about the stuff that never got done. There's a bunch of novelizations of screenplays that they couldn't film,
Right.
including one that featured an interesting branch of the Federation called the Special Security Division, or the SSD. And they're kind of, if anyone's ever seen Babylon 5, the SSD are kind of like the Cyclops. Black uniforms and everything, with, of course, colored collar and stripes for anyone ranking above Oberleutnant. But, yeah, that was another one that I guess they felt, this is going to go into the idea of the ship having a Zampal, let's not do this, which I thought, frankly, was bunk.
Yeah, the most notorious one was A Portrait in Black and White. It was a full screenplay written by Barry Trivers, who did The Conscience of the King. It was Gene Roddenberry's idea. And they beamed down on a planet that's a parallel world, Earth planet, Civil War era, or pre-Civil War. And blacks are the ruling people, and whites are the ones who are slaves. And the landing party's captured, and Kirk and all of them are put in shackles, and the whole thing, and Gamora ends up saving them. But it made a great, powerful statement about, what that's like to go through that. And NBC said, we cannot put this episode on the air.
Let me move on to the next one. We're running out of time.
Next.
Can I make one slight comment?
Sure.
There's one thing that's easy to do. Scare a network. All you have to do is say, well, I'm not so sure that the black people would like, or I'm not so sure that the Jews would like, or I'm not so sure that the whatever. But you can scare hell out of them easily, with no sweat whatsoever.
Less so now.
Less so now.
Well, there was one memo in this book where NBC says, somebody calls a character, he says, you're crazy. And they said, you got to take that out. They didn't want to offend the crazy people.
Yes, sir.
3 quick questions to all of you. One is, you mentioned how Lucy was with Desilu was very up on getting Star Trek on the air. Why was that? Was she friends with Gene Roddenberry? Or?
No, because they invented that. Desi invented Desilu Studios and the idea of them owning shows. They owned I Love Lucy. And they created reruns. That was the first show to go into reruns. And so that's what built Desilu. And by the time Star Trek was being shot, Desilu only had one show that they owned, and that was the Lucy show. So Lucy and Desi had broken up at that point. She was running the studio, and she was determined she wanted to own some property. And she liked that concept, and she believed in it. And she said, we can do this. And the financiers kept saying, no, you'll go broke, and she went forward anyway.
Second question. I don't know names of episodes. I'll describe it. I believe this was a man from the future who went back in time and sabotaged an Apollo mission.
Yeah, Simon Earth.
I heard they were going to do an offshoot with that episode.
It was a pilot. It was what's called a backdoor pilot. There was a series that Gene Roddenberry created, and coincidentally Art Wallace created the same show with a different title, and they both pitched it to NBC, and NBC said, why don't you two get together and collaborate? And they couldn't get the money together to get it made, so they said, well, why don't you do it as the last episode of season 2 of Star Trek? In case we cancel Star Trek, maybe we'll buy that as a series. That's how that got made.
Okay. Last question. I had heard George Takei speak at a convention a long time ago, right after Star Trek the movie. And at that time, I didn't know, and he's since then been a very strong proponent for gay rights. Did anybody know at the time that he was gay?
No. They would have been all right with it if he was. Star Trek was a very, very liberal show.
Yeah.
But no, he didn't come out at that point.
First off, thank you very much for coming here with this panel. Star Trek was very progressive at its time, probably one of the first beacons of multiculturalism on television. I grew up watching it with my dad. I still remember when Next Generation was coming on, Ron and the Hills of Voyage Home, blah, 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 whatever. The point is, I had a Phase 2 question. And how much Phase 2 actually looked into Next Generation? That might be an invalid question for this, and if it is, I'll just go away. But how much of Phase 2 was recycled into Next Generation?
A couple episodes. The one about the woman who becomes pregnant.
The child.
Grows so quickly, and that was going to be a Phase 2 episode. Phase 2 was just weeks. Matter of fact, it was 1 week away from filming in 1976. They had 12 scripts written, and the first episode was going to be a 2-hour TV movie. And Star Wars came out, and Paramount switched gears real quick. They had all the cast except for Nimoy, and they said, okay, we're going to do that pilot, that 2-hour movie as a feature film, and that was Star Trek The Motion Picture. All the other episodes, I think 3 of them got recycled into Next Generation.
Okay, thank you.
Let me ask a question. Have you heard from anybody, any of the big names on the series? You know, the people that everyone knows: Shatner, Nimoy, Gene Koenig, or Walter Koenig. Anybody?
Yeah, well, Leonard Nimoy called me and said it was astounding. The research was astounding. It sounds so much like Spock, except chills up my spine. Walter Koenig called and agreed to write the foreword for book 2 because he read book 1 and he said, Mark, I trust you. He said, you didn't have an agenda. Your only agenda was to tell the story and use the documents and let everybody have a fair say. So he wrote the foreword for book 2, a wonderful foreword. Somebody came over to us at the Star Trek convention in Vegas to buy a book because William Shatner sent him over. He says, Shatner's walking around with your book backstage and keeps saying, look at this, look at this. He hasn't called me. But and our friend Harlan Ellison called me the other day and he said, Mark, I'm not going to say it's, what was the word he used? Awesome. He said, Mark, I'm not going to say it's awesome because that's a word I hold back for Eleanor Roosevelt and the Grand Canyon, but it comes close. But by the way, the name of the character was Edith Keeler, not Edith Kessler. It was a typo.
Let me talk about the book a little bit. First of all, this book is available on Amazon, but it's also available downstairs. Okay, we're in Artist Alley, 842. Come on down and see us. If you don't get a chance to come down and see us there, that bookmark that I gave you as you came in, or if you didn't get one, I'll give you on the way out, has the website for Jacobs Brown Press on it, where you can get this book as well. This is called contrary to what the title is these are the Voyages, TOS, Season 1. Season 2 is due out in January, and Season 3 to follow shortly thereafter. Also, ebook version of the first book coming out very soon. Okay, any other questions? Yes?
If we come to the booth and get the book, will any of you sign it?
They'll all sign.
We're all signed. We're all down there for the next couple hours. And we don't charge for our signatures.
That's very un-Star Trek of you. Anything you'd like to add, John?
Well,
What is your take on this phenomenon of Star Trek? Both of you.
well, frankly, I don't know. I have no idea. Mark is of the mind that Bobby Justman knew that it was going to be a hit. That's why he saved the memos and the scripts and this, that, and the other. That Gene knew. That's why he saved the memos and the scripts and then whatever. But I don't think anybody knew.
In regard to Bob Justman, and whether he knew or didn't know, our memory of Bob Justman is referring to it using a Yiddish word that he was fond of. He called it Star Trek. And that does not mean,
Trust.
it means something that until very recently had to be written S.T. regular pages. But that was what he called it, Star Trek.
But he loved it.
Oh my, he loved it.
He loved it. He said, "I loved them all, even Spock's brain." But it was just such hard work. It was so hard to make that show and get it on each episode. And I think that's why Price said that. By the way, what does DF stand for?
Damn fool.
Damn fool.
No, Donald.
I hope you'll join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you all for coming.